Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped off the military transport bus at Naval Base Norfolk, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and orders clutched tightly in her hand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete walkways as sailors in crisp uniforms hurried past her toward their assigned duties. At 25, Sarah looked younger than her years, with her slight frame and quiet demeanor that often led people to underestimate her capabilities. She had graduated top of her class from the Naval Academy, but that achievement felt distant now as she faced her first real assignment. The base sprawled before her like a small city, with towering ships moored at the piers and aircraft carriers dominating the horizon. The smell of salt air mixed with diesel fuel and fresh paint created an atmosphere that was both exciting and intimidating. "You must be the new transfer!" a voice called out behind her. Sarah turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered sailor approaching with a clipboard in hand. His name tag read Petty Officer Martinez, and his expression was friendly enough, though she noticed his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a way that made her slightly uncomfortable. "Yes, Lieutenant Chen reporting for duty," she replied, maintaining professional composure despite feeling out of place. Martinez chuckled and shook his head. "Lieutenant? Well, I'll be damned. They're making them younger every year." He gestured for her to follow him toward a cluster of administrative buildings. "Come on, I'll show you where you need to check in. Fair warning, though, the guys around here aren't used to having women in command positions. Might take some getting used to." As they walked across the base, Sarah noticed the stares and whispered conversations that seemed to follow in her wake. Groups of sailors would stop talking when she passed, only to resume in hushed tones once she was out of earshot. She had expected some level of scrutiny as a newcomer, but the intensity of the attention felt more personal than professional. The administrative building was a sterile, fluorescent-lit maze of cubicles and offices. Martinez led her to a reception desk where a stern-faced yeoman processed her paperwork with mechanical efficiency. The whole process took nearly 2 hours, during which Sarah learned she would be assigned to the operations department under Commander Hayes, a veteran officer with a reputation for being tough but fair. "Your quarters are in Building C, Room 237, the yeoman informed her, handing over a set of keys and a thick folder of base regulations. "Chow hall hours are posted on your welcome packet. Any questions?" Sarah shook her head and thanked him before following Martinez back outside. The base seemed even busier now, with work crews loading supplies onto ships and officers conducting inspections along the piers. The constant activity was energizing, and she felt a surge of excitement about beginning her naval career in earnest. "I'll take you to your quarters first, then show you around the department," Martinez offered. As they walked, he kept up a steady stream of conversation about base life, pointing out important buildings and sharing gossip about various officers and enlisted personnel. Sarah listened politely, filing away information that might prove useful later. Building C was a relatively new dormitory-style structure with long hallways and identical doors marked with room numbers. Sarah's quarters turned out to be a small but adequate space with a single bed, desk, dresser, and small refrigerator. A narrow window looked out over the parking lot, offering a less than inspiring view but providing natural light. "Not exactly the Ritz, but it's home," Martinez commented, leaning against the doorframe. "Most of the junior officers hang out at the club on Friday nights if you're looking to socialize. Good way to get to know people." After Martinez left, Sarah unpacked her belongings methodically, hanging her uniforms in the small closet and arranging her personal items on the desk. The silence in the room was almost oppressive after the constant noise of the base outside. She had lived in similar quarters during her time at the academy, but somehow this felt different, more permanent and isolating. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find 3 sailors standing in the hallway, all wearing the cocky grins that she had learned to recognize as trouble during her academy days. The one in front, a stocky man with arms covered in tattoos, stepped forward slightly. "Well, well, look what we have here," he said, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "The new girl. Heard you're supposed to be an officer. That true?" Sarah straightened her posture and met his gaze directly. "Lieutenant Chen. And you are?" The three men exchanged glances and chuckled. "Oh, she's got some attitude," the tattooed sailor continued. "I'm Ramirez, and these are my friends Johnson and Walsh. We just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. Make sure you understand how things work around here." There was something in their tone that put Sarah immediately on guard. She had dealt with similar situations before, but never while completely alone and isolated from any support system. "I appreciate the welcome. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish unpacking." She started to close the door, but Ramirez put his hand against it, preventing her from shutting it completely. "Hold on there, Lieutenant," he said, emphasizing her rank with obvious sarcasm. "We're not done talking. See, this is a tight-knit community here, and we look out for each other. But that means everyone needs to understand their place." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but kept her voice steady. "I think I understand my place just fine. Thank you." Johnson, a lanky sailor with pale skin and cold eyes, spoke up for the first time. "Do you? Because from where we stand, it looks like the Navy is handing out gold bars to anyone these days. Doesn't matter if they can actually handle the responsibility." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest. She had faced similar challenges throughout her career, from instructors who questioned whether women belonged in combat roles to classmates who assumed her high grades were the result of favoritism rather than hard work. But she had learned that responding with emotion usually only made things worse. "I earned my commission the same way everyone else did," she replied calmly. "Through hard work and dedication to serving my country." Walsh, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. He was older than the others, probably in his early 30s, with graying temples and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "That's a nice speech, Lieutenant. But speeches don't mean much when lives are on the line. This isn't the academy anymore. Out here, respect has to be earned, not handed out with pretty ribbons." The three men stood there for a moment, clearly expecting some kind of response that would give them an excuse to escalate the situation. But Sarah had learned patience during her years of training, and she recognized a test when she saw one. These sailors were trying to establish dominance, to make her feel small and intimidated so they could maintain their sense of superiority. "I understand that respect is earned," she said finally, "and I'm prepared to prove myself through my actions rather than my words. Now, if there's nothing else, I really do need to finish getting settled in." Ramirez looked disappointed by her measured response, but after a moment, he stepped back from the door. "Sure thing, Lieutenant. We'll be seeing you around. This is a small base, after all." The three sailors turned and walked away, their conversation immediately becoming animated as they discussed what had just happened. Sarah closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She had handled the situation as well as could be expected, but she knew this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into learning her new duties and responsibilities. The operations department was housed in a modern facility near the center of the base, where teams of officers and enlisted personnel coordinated ship movements, logistics operations, and training exercises. Commander Hayes proved to be exactly as advertised, demanding but fair, with high standards for everyone under his command. Sarah's immediate supervisor was Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who had worked her way up through the ranks over nearly 2 decades. Wells took Sarah under her wing from the first day, providing guidance on base procedures and introducing her to key personnel throughout the department. "The most important thing to remember," Wells told her during their first meeting, is that this job is all about attention to detail. One small mistake in scheduling or logistics can affect an entire mission. The sailors and officers counting on us don't have the luxury of second chances. Sarah found the work challenging and engaging. Exactly the kind of responsibility she had hoped for when she chose the Navy as her career. She spent her days coordinating supply deliveries, updating training schedules, and working with various department heads to ensure smooth operations across the base. It was complex work that required constant communication and careful planning, but she felt confident in her abilities. However, the social challenges proved more difficult to navigate. The three sailors from her first day, Ramirez, Johnson, and Walsh, seemed to pop up everywhere she went on the base. They never did anything overtly hostile, but their presence felt threatening nonetheless. They would appear in the chow hall when she was eating alone, standing just close enough to make her uncomfortable. They would walk past her table at the club, making comments just loud enough for her to hear about academy princesses and officers who haven't proven themselves yet. Other personnel began to take notice of the situation, but responses varied widely. Some officers seemed sympathetic but unwilling to get involved in what they saw as a personal matter. Others appeared to view the harassment as a normal part of military life, a hazing process that everyone had to endure. A few enlisted sailors seemed to enjoy the entertainment, watching from a distance as the drama played out. Sarah tried to focus on her work and ignore the constant undercurrent of hostility, but the stress began to take its toll. She found herself eating meals at odd hours to avoid crowds in the chow hall. She stopped going to the officers' club altogether, preferring to spend her evenings alone in her quarters. Sleep became elusive as she lay awake wondering what new challenges the next day would bring. The situation came to a head during her second week on the base. Sarah was working late in the operations center, finishing up some reports that needed to be submitted the next morning. Most of the day shift had already gone home, leaving the building largely empty except for a few watchstanders and cleaning personnel. She was concentrating on her computer screen when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her office. The sound stopped just outside her door, and she looked up to see the familiar silhouettes of Ramirez, Johnson, and Walsh through the frosted glass. Her heart began to race as she realized how isolated she was in the building at this hour. The door opened without a knock, and the three men walked in as if they owned the place. Ramirez closed the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the small office space. "Working late, Lieutenant?" he asked with false concern. "That's dedication. Or maybe you just don't have anywhere else to be." Sarah saved her work and turned to face them, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm finishing up some reports. Was there something you needed?" Johnson laughed and shook his head. "Oh, we don't need anything from you. We just thought it was time for a more private conversation. You know, officer to enlisted, woman to men." The implications in his tone made Sarah's skin crawl, but she forced herself to remain calm. She was trained for situations like this, both in terms of military protocol and personal safety. The first rule was to avoid escalation while looking for opportunities to de-escalate or escape. "I think any conversation we need to have can wait until normal business hours," she replied, standing up slowly and moving toward the door, "with appropriate witnesses present." Walsh moved to block her path, his expression more serious than she had seen before. "See, that's where you're wrong, Lieutenant. This conversation is long overdue, and we're tired of waiting for you to get the message." Sarah felt trapped between her desk and the three men, but she refused to show fear. Years of training had taught her that predators fed on weakness, and giving in to panic would only make the situation worse. Instead, she focused on her breathing and looked for any opportunity to change the dynamic of the encounter. "What message would that be?" she asked, genuinely curious about what they thought they were accomplishing. Ramirez stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The message that you don't belong here, that pretty uniforms and academy degrees don't mean anything when things get real, that maybe you should consider a different career path before you get yourself or someone else hurt. The threat was clear now, though carefully worded to avoid anything that could be easily reported or proven. Sarah realized that these men had planned this encounter carefully, choosing a time and place where their word would carry more weight than hers if it came to an official complaint. But they had also made a crucial mistake. They assumed that because she was small, young, and female, she would be easy to intimidate. They didn't know about the hours she had spent in combat training or the leadership courses that had taught her how to handle difficult personnel situations. Most importantly, they didn't know about the letter locked in her quarters, the one that would change everything about her future and their perception of who they were dealing with. For now, though, Sarah had to focus on getting through this immediate crisis. She looked each man in the eye, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel, and made a decision that would set the tone for everything that followed. Sarah took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, meeting each man's gaze with unwavering determination. The small office suddenly felt charged with tension as she made her choice about how to respond to their intimidation tactics. "I understand that you have concerns about my qualifications," she said evenly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise all three men. "But if you have official complaints about my performance or conduct, there are proper channels for addressing those concerns. This is not one of them." Walsh seemed taken aback by her composed response. "You think you can just hide behind regulations and paperwork? Real leadership isn't about following rules. It's about earning respect from the people you're supposed to command." "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed, which clearly wasn't the response they had expected. "Respect is earned through actions, not intimidation tactics, which is why I'm giving you one opportunity to leave this office and pretend this conversation never happened." Ramirez laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. "Or what? You'll report us for having a friendly chat with a superior officer?" Sarah moved slightly to her left, positioning herself closer to the emergency phone on the wall while maintaining eye contact with all three men. "No. I'll report you for threatening a superior officer, creating a hostile work environment, and attempting to interfere with official Navy business, all of which are violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that could result in court-martial proceedings." The confidence in her voice and her knowledge of military law clearly caught them off guard. Johnson looked nervous for the first time since they had entered the office. "Nobody's threatening anyone here. We're just having a conversation." "A conversation that began when you blocked my exit and continued with veiled threats about my career and safety," Sarah replied calmly. "I've been recording our entire interaction on my phone, which was activated the moment you entered my office without permission." This was a bluff, but it had the desired effect. All three men glanced toward her desk, where her phone lay face down, suddenly uncertain about what evidence might exist of their behavior. The dynamic in the room shifted as they realized their carefully planned intimidation session wasn't going according to script. "Look, Lieutenant," Walsh said, his tone becoming more conciliatory, "maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. We're not trying to cause problems. We just wanted to make sure you understand what you're getting into." Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing the beginning of their retreat. "I appreciate your concern. Now I'm sure you all have duties to attend to, just as I do." The three men exchanged glances, clearly communicating without words about how to extract themselves from the situation. After a moment, Ramirez shrugged and turned toward the door. "Sure thing, Lieutenant. Enjoy the rest of your evening." They filed out of the office, leaving Sarah alone with her racing heart and shaking hands. She waited until their footsteps had faded completely before allowing herself to collapse back into her chair. The confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours had passed. She sat in the quiet office for a long time, processing what had just happened and considering her options. Reporting the incident would be the proper course of action, but it would also escalate the situation and potentially make her life on the base even more difficult. The three sailors would likely claim it was a misunderstanding, and without concrete evidence of threats, it would become a matter of her word against theirs. On the other hand, letting the incident pass without consequences would signal that she could be intimidated and might encourage further harassment. Sarah had learned during her academy years that bullies rarely stop their behavior unless forced to do so through official channels or overwhelming deterrent force. The decision was made for her the next morning when she discovered that her confrontation with the three sailors had not gone unnoticed. Lieutenant Commander Wells was waiting in her office when Sarah arrived for duty, her expression serious but not unsympathetic. "I heard you had some visitors last night," Wells said without preamble. "Want to tell me what happened?" Sarah recounted the events of the previous evening, keeping her report factual and professional while Wells listened without interruption. When she finished, her supervisor leaned back in her chair and sighed deeply. "This isn't the first time those three have caused problems," Wells admitted. "Ramirez has been here for 4 years and has never been promoted above his current rank, despite having the time in service for advancement. Johnson and Walsh are both approaching the end of their current enlistments and aren't expected to re-enlist. They're bitter about their lack of career progression and have a history of taking out their frustrations on newer personnel." "Are you suggesting I should just ignore the situation?" Sarah asked, surprised by what seemed like a dismissive attitude. Wells shook her head quickly. "Not at all. I'm telling you that these men are known troublemakers who have managed to stay just this side of serious disciplinary action. But this time, they picked the wrong target." There was something in Wells's tone that suggested she knew more than she was saying, but before Sarah could ask for clarification, Commander Hayes appeared in the doorway. "Lieutenant Chen, could I see you in my office, please?" he requested, his expression unreadable. Sarah followed her commanding officer down the hallway to his larger office, wondering if word of the previous night's incident had already reached the department head. Hayes closed the door behind them and gestured for her to take a seat in one of the chairs facing his desk. "I've been reviewing your personnel file," he began, opening a thick folder that contained her complete service record. "Impressive academics at the academy, outstanding fitness scores, high marks in leadership evaluations. Your instructors spoke very highly of your potential." Sarah waited for him to get to the point, uncertain whether this was related to the harassment incident or something else entirely. Hayes continued reading from her file. "It says here that you completed advanced training in strategic planning, international relations, and logistics management. You also participated in several high-level simulations and exercises that are usually reserved for more senior officers." "Yes, sir. I was fortunate to be selected for those programs." "Fortunate?" Hayes smiled slightly. "I don't think luck had much to do with it. These programs are invitation only, based on recommendations from senior faculty and demonstrated performance in complex scenarios." He closed the file and leaned forward slightly. "Lieutenant, I'm going to share something with you that's not common knowledge on this base. Your assignment here is temporary, and it's not random." Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "Sir?" "You're here for 6 months to gain experience in operational planning and base-level administration. After that, you'll be attending the Naval War College for advanced studies in strategic leadership. Following your graduation from War College, you'll be assigned to the Pentagon for a 2-year rotation in fleet planning." The information hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. She had hoped for challenging assignments throughout her career, but the path Hayes was describing was far more accelerated than anything she had imagined. The Naval War College was typically reserved for lieutenant commanders and commanders who were being groomed for senior leadership positions. "I don't understand," she said honestly. "Those assignments are usually for officers with much more experience." Hayes nodded. "Under normal circumstances, yes. But these aren't normal circumstances. The Navy is facing significant challenges in the coming years, And there's a recognition that we need to identify and develop promising officers much earlier in their careers. He paused and studied her face carefully. Lieutenant, are you familiar with the concept of succession planning? Sarah nodded slowly. The process of identifying and preparing personnel for senior leadership positions. Exactly. And you've been identified as someone with exceptional potential for high-level command responsibility. Your performance over the next 6 months will determine the speed and scope of your advancement, but the trajectory has already been established. The implications of what Hayes was telling her were staggering. Sarah had always been ambitious and had hoped for a successful naval career, but she had assumed it would follow the traditional path of gradual advancement over many years. The accelerated timeline he was describing would put her on track for senior officer positions while she was still in her 30s. Sir, I'm honored by the confidence that's been placed in me, but I have to ask why you're telling me this now. Hayes's expression became more serious. Because of the incident last night with Ramirez, Johnson, and Walsh, Lieutenant Commander Wells briefed me on what happened, and I want you to understand the larger context of your situation here. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. I handled the situation as professionally as I could under the circumstances. You handled it perfectly, Hayes assured her, which is exactly what I would expect from someone with your training and potential. But I want you to understand that those 3 sailors represent a very small minority of the personnel on this base. The vast majority of our people are professional, dedicated service members who will respect your rank and authority. He stood up and moved to look out the window at the bustling base outside. However, there will always be individuals who resist change, who feel threatened by competent leaders who don't fit their preconceived notions of what an officer should look like. Your challenge will be learning to deal with those individuals while focusing on your primary mission. Sarah absorbed this information, realizing that her experience over the past 2 weeks suddenly made more sense. The intense scrutiny, the whispered conversations, the testing behavior. It all stemmed from people trying to figure out who she was and why she was there. What would you recommend as my course of action regarding last night's incident? She asked. Hayes turned back to face her. That depends on what you hope to accomplish. If you want to send a message that harassment won't be tolerated, we can pursue formal disciplinary action. If you want to demonstrate your leadership skills by handling difficult personnel situations, you might consider a different approach. Sarah considered her options carefully. Filing formal complaints would establish clear boundaries and potentially protect other personnel from similar treatment. But it would also mark her as someone who relied on regulations rather than personal authority to solve problems. On the other hand, finding a way to address the situation through leadership rather than paperwork would demonstrate her capability as a future senior officer. I'd like to try the leadership approach first, she decided, with the understanding that formal action remains an option if the behavior continues. Hayes smiled approvingly. Good choice. Do you have a plan for how you want to proceed? Over the next hour, Sarah and Hayes discussed various strategies for dealing with difficult personnel while maintaining unit cohesion and morale. Hayes shared examples from his own career of situations where personal leadership had been more effective than formal discipline, as well as instances where official action had been necessary to protect the mission and other personnel. When she left his office, Sarah felt both energized and overwhelmed by the new information about her career trajectory. The knowledge that she was being groomed for senior leadership positions was exciting, but also intimidating. It meant that every decision she made and every challenge she faced would be evaluated not just in terms of immediate outcomes, but as indicators of her potential for future responsibility. The next few weeks passed relatively quietly as Sarah focused on mastering her duties and building relationships with other personnel throughout the operations department. She made a point of eating in the main chow hall during peak hours, demonstrating that she wasn't intimidated by the 3 sailors who had confronted her. When she encountered Ramirez, Johnson, or Walsh in the course of her duties, she maintained a professional demeanor while making it clear that she expected the same from them. Her work performance continued to excel as she took on increasingly complex assignments and began participating in higher-level planning meetings. Commander Hayes and Lieutenant Commander Wells provided guidance and feedback, but they also gave her significant autonomy to develop her own approaches to problem-solving and personnel management. Sarah also began to notice subtle changes in how other base personnel interacted with her. Officers who had initially seemed reserved or skeptical now sought her input on operational matters. Enlisted personnel who had been watching from the sidelines began approaching her with questions and requests for assistance. The atmosphere of uncertainty that had surrounded her arrival was gradually being replaced by professional acceptance and even respect. The turning point came during her 6th week on the base, when a major training exercise required round-the-clock coordination between multiple departments and external units. Sarah was assigned as the primary liaison between operations and the participating ships, a responsibility that typically went to more senior officers. The exercise involved coordinating the movements of 12 ships, 3 squadrons of aircraft, and over 2,000 personnel across a 3-day period. Sarah found herself working 18-hour days, managing complex schedules and resolving conflicts between competing priorities. It was exactly the kind of high-pressure, high-visibility assignment that could make or break a junior officer's reputation. On the 2nd day of the exercise, a critical supply shipment was delayed due to weather conditions, threatening to disrupt the entire training schedule. Sarah had to quickly develop alternative solutions while keeping all stakeholders informed and maintaining the overall exercise timeline. She was in the middle of coordinating emergency supply runs when she noticed Ramirez standing near her workstation, apparently waiting for her attention. The past few weeks had seen minimal interaction between them, and she wondered what he might want in the middle of such a critical operation. "Lieutenant," he said when she finally had a moment to acknowledge him, "I wanted to let you know that my team has completed the cargo manifest verification you requested. Everything checks out." Sarah looked at him carefully, noting the respectful tone and proper military bearing. This was a far cry from the confrontational sailor who had threatened her weeks earlier. "Thank you, Petty Officer Ramirez. That information is exactly what I needed to coordinate with the transport aircraft." He nodded and started to turn away, then paused and looked back at her. "Ma'am, if I may say so, you've done an outstanding job coordinating this exercise. The operations have been running smoother than I've seen in years." The compliment was unexpected and seemed genuine. Sarah thanked him professionally and turned back to her work, but the interaction left her thoughtful about the changes that had occurred over the past month and a half. Later that evening, as the exercise concluded successfully, Lieutenant Commander Wells approached Sarah's workstation with a satisfied smile. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant. Commander Hayes asked me to tell you that Admiral Richardson was impressed with the coordination and efficiency of the exercise. That's high praise from someone who's seen a lot of operations over his career." Sarah felt a surge of pride at the recognition, but Wells wasn't finished. "There's something else," Wells continued, lowering her voice slightly. "Admiral Richardson specifically asked about you. He wanted to know who was responsible for the logistics coordination and what your background was." The mention of Admiral Richardson's interest sent a chill down Sarah's spine. As the base commander, he was the highest-ranking officer she had encountered since arriving, and his opinion would carry significant weight in her career development. "What did you tell him?" Sarah asked nervously. Wells smiled mysteriously. "I told him he should ask you himself. He wants to see you in his office tomorrow morning at 800. Sarah arrived at Admiral Richardson's office at 7:55, allowing herself time to compose her thoughts before the meeting. The Admiral's suite was located in the base headquarters building, surrounded by the offices of other senior staff members and protected by layers of security and protocol. She had never been this close to the center of base operations, and the significance of being summoned there was not lost on her. Admiral Richardson's secretary, a professional-looking petty officer first class, directed her to wait in a small anteroom furnished with leather chairs and naval memorabilia. At precisely 0800, the inner office door opened, and Admiral Richardson himself appeared. Sarah had seen him from a distance during various ceremonies and briefings, but this was her first close encounter with the man who commanded the entire base. He was tall and distinguished, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His uniform was immaculate, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from decades of leadership experience. "Lieutenant Chen, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to enter his office. "Please have a seat." The Admiral's office was spacious and tastefully decorated with naval artifacts, charts of local waters, and photographs documenting his long career. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the harbor and the ships moored there. Sarah took the indicated chair and waited for him to begin the conversation. "I've been watching your progress since you arrived 6 weeks ago," Admiral Richardson began, settling into his own chair behind a large desk. "Your handling of the recent training exercise was particularly impressive. Complex logistics operations like that require both technical skill and leadership ability." "Thank you, sir. I had excellent support from the operations department and all the participating units." Admiral Richardson smiled slightly. "Spoken like a true leader, sharing credit while accepting responsibility. That's exactly the kind of attitude that caught our attention in the first place." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of uncertainty. The Admiral's words suggested this conversation was about more than just recognizing good performance during a single exercise. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand what you mean." The Admiral opened a folder on his desk and reviewed its contents briefly before looking back at her. "Lieutenant, are you familiar with the Navy's Strategic Leadership Development Program?" Sarah shook her head. She had never heard of such a program, despite her extensive knowledge of naval policies and procedures. "It's a classified initiative that identifies exceptional junior officers with the potential for senior command positions," Admiral Richardson explained. "Participants undergo accelerated development through challenging assignments, advanced education, and mentoring by senior leadership. The program is designed to prepare selected individuals for flag officer rank by their early 40s. The implications of what he was saying hit Sarah like a physical blow. Flag officer rank meant admiral, the highest levels of naval command. The idea that she could be considered for such positions at her age and experience level seemed impossible. "Sir, I'm honored that anyone would consider me for such a program, but I've only been in the Navy for 3 years. Surely there are more qualified candidates." Admiral Richardson leaned forward slightly. "Lieutenant, exceptional leadership potential isn't always correlated with time in service. Some of our most successful admirals showed their abilities early in their careers and were given opportunities to develop those skills rapidly." He paused and studied her face carefully. "The question is whether you're ready for that kind of responsibility and acceleration. The program isn't just an honor. It's demanding, high pressure, and highly visible. Failures are noticed at the highest levels of naval command." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered, but also excited by the challenge it represented. Everything she had worked for since joining the Navy was leading to this moment. "What would participation in the program involve?" she asked. "Your current assignment here is actually the first phase," Admiral Richardson revealed. "We needed to see how you handled real operational responsibility under pressure, how you dealt with difficult personnel situations, and how you adapted to a new environment." The pieces suddenly fell into place. Her assignment to Norfolk, the carefully structured challenges she had faced, even the harassment from Ramirez, Johnson, and Walsh. It had all been part of an evaluation process. "The 3 sailors who confronted me," she said slowly, "was that arranged?" Admiral Richardson's expression became more serious. "Absolutely not. That was a genuine incident involving real troublemakers who have been problematic for some time. How you handled that situation was entirely your own decision, and it was exactly what we hoped to see from someone with flag officer potential." He stood up and moved to look out the window at the harbor. "Leadership isn't just about making good decisions when everything is going smoothly. It's about maintaining professionalism and effectiveness when faced with hostility, uncertainty, and pressure. You demonstrated all of those qualities during your time here." Sarah processed this information, realizing that her entire experience at Norfolk had been both more significant and more carefully observed than she had imagined. Every challenge she had faced, every decision she had made, had been part of a larger evaluation. "What happens next?" she asked. Admiral Richardson turned back to face her. "If you accept the program, you'll continue with the accelerated timeline I'm sure Commander Hayes has already discussed with you. Naval War College, Pentagon assignment, and then command positions with increasing responsibility. The goal is to have you ready for selection to Rear Admiral by age 35. The timeline was breathtaking. Sarah had assumed she would spend decades working her way up through the ranks, if she was successful at all. The opportunity to reach flag rank while still in her 30s was beyond anything she had ever imagined. "I accept," she said without hesitation. Admiral Richardson smiled broadly. "I was hoping you would say that. There's one more thing you need to know, though. This base will be your first command assignment in approximately 8 years. You'll return here as the base commander." The revelation struck Sarah speechless. The base where she had faced her first real challenges, where she had been tested and had proven herself, would eventually be under her command. The symmetry of it was almost poetic. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll remember this conversation when you're making decisions as an admiral," he replied. "Remember what it felt like to be underestimated and challenged. Remember the sailors who supported you and those who tried to tear you down. Most importantly, remember that leadership is about service, not power." After leaving Admiral Richardson's office, Sarah walked across the base in a daze, trying to process the enormous changes that lay ahead. The future she had just been offered was more ambitious than her wildest dreams, but it also came with responsibilities that seemed almost overwhelming. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice the commotion near the administrative building. A crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an official announcement posted on the bulletin board. Sarah approached curiously and saw personnel reading and discussing a notice about upcoming personnel changes. "Can you believe this?" she heard one sailor saying to another. "They're actually going to announce the new base commander early. Richardson is retiring next year, and they want to give everyone time to prepare for the transition." Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized what they might be discussing. She moved closer to read the announcement herself, wondering if her conversation with Admiral Richardson was somehow related to the timing of this notice. The official notice was brief but clear. "Admiral Richardson has announced his intention to retire following completion of 35 years of distinguished service. The selection process for his replacement is currently underway, with the new base commander expected to assume duties in approximately 18 months. Sarah was still processing this information when she noticed a familiar voice behind her. 18 months, Ramirez was saying to Johnson and Walsh. "Wonder what kind of commander we'll get. Hopefully someone who understands what it takes to really run a base like this." Johnson nodded in agreement. "Has to be better than having some academy princess calling the shots. Can you imagine if they put someone like that new lieutenant in charge? We'd be a laughingstock." Walsh laughed harshly. "That'll never happen. The Navy isn't stupid enough to put someone that young and inexperienced in a command position. especially not a woman who can't even handle a few sailors asking questions." Sarah turned around slowly, meeting the eyes of the three men who had made her first weeks on the base so challenging. They recognized her immediately, and their conversation stopped abruptly as they realized she had overheard their comments. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about the upcoming change in command." Ramirez tried to recover first. "Just speculation, Lieutenant. Nothing official, of course." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. Speculation can be interesting, though. For example, I'm speculating about what it might be like to work under a commander who remembers every interaction they've had with base personnel, especially those early encounters that reveal so much about character and professionalism." The three men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not sure what she was getting at, but sensing some kind of underlying threat in her words. "I'm also speculating," Sarah continued, "about the kind of commander who might value loyalty, respect, and the ability to work with all types of people, regardless of their background or appearance." Walsh stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, if you're referring to our conversation a few weeks ago, I think there might have been some misunderstandings." Sarah smiled coldly. "Oh, I don't think there were any misunderstandings. I think the conversation was quite clear and very revealing about the character of everyone involved." She paused, letting the tension build before continuing. "The thing about speculation is that sometimes it can become reality in unexpected ways. Sometimes the people we dismiss or underestimate can surprise us." Johnson looked nervous now. "Lieutenant, we never meant any disrespect. We were just trying to help you understand how things work around here." "And I appreciate that educational effort," Sarah replied. "It taught me valuable lessons about leadership, about the importance of maintaining professionalism under pressure, and about the different types of people I might encounter in positions of responsibility." She looked directly at each man in turn. "Those lessons will be very useful in my future assignments." The three sailors stood there uncomfortably, clearly wanting to escape the conversation, but not knowing how to do so without making things worse. Sarah decided to put them out of their misery. "Well, I should get back to my duties. I'm sure you all have work to attend to as well." As she walked away, Sarah could hear them discussing what had just happened in hushed, worried tones. She felt a small sense of satisfaction at their discomfort, but more than that, she felt a profound sense of completion. The scared, uncertain young officer who had arrived at Norfolk 6 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own capabilities and was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Over the next few months, word began to spread through unofficial channels about Sarah's participation in the Strategic Leadership Development Program. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some personnel expressed surprise and skepticism, while others pointed to her performance during various exercises and assignments as evidence that she had earned the opportunity. Ramirez, Johnson, and Walsh became noticeably more subdued in their interactions with other personnel. The three men seemed to realize that their confrontation with Sarah might have more serious long-term consequences than they had initially understood. They completed their duties professionally but avoided any situation that might bring them to her attention again. Sarah threw herself into her remaining time at Norfolk, knowing that every experience and every lesson learned would be valuable in her future assignments. She worked closely with Commander Hayes and Lieutenant Commander Wells to master increasingly complex operational challenges, and she began sitting in on senior staff meetings to observe high-level decision-making processes. 6 months after her arrival at Norfolk, Sarah received orders for her next assignment, the Naval War College. As she packed her belongings and prepared to leave the base where she had first proven herself, she reflected on how much had changed since that first day when she had stepped off the transport bus. Admiral Richardson personally saw her off, shaking her hand and offering final words of advice. "Remember, Lieutenant, leadership is a privilege, not a right. Use it wisely." As her transport pulled away from the base, Sarah looked back at the sprawling complex that would one day be under her command. She thought about the sailors and officers who worked there, including the 3 men who had tried to intimidate her and had inadvertently strengthened her resolve instead. In 8 years, she would return as Admiral Chen, commanding officer of Naval Base Norfolk. The scared young woman who had once been dismissed as the new girl would be responsible for the careers and welfare of thousands of personnel. It was a responsibility she now felt ready to embrace. The base grew smaller in the distance until it finally disappeared from view. But Sarah knew she would carry the lessons she had learned there for the rest of her career. Sometimes the greatest challenges came from unexpected directions, and sometimes the people who seemed most threatening were actually providing the most valuable preparation for future leadership. As the transport headed toward her new assignment and her accelerated path to flag rank, Sarah Chen smiled and began planning for the day when she would return to Norfolk as the base commander. She had a feeling that would be a very interesting homecoming indeed. The Navy had tested her, challenged her, and ultimately chosen her for extraordinary responsibility. Now, it was her turn to prove that their faith had been well placed, and that the young lieutenant who had refused to be intimidated by 3 hostile sailors was ready to become the admiral who would one day command them all.